I'm Eric Bruns. I'm a professor and associate director of the School Mental Health Assessment Research and Training Center. And I'm pleased to be able to get us started today with our first of the 2023 Smart Center Speaker Series. So again, please introduce yourself in the chat box. Make sure the drop down says to panelists and attendees so everyone can see. So again, welcome to the University of Washington Smart Center's 2023 Virtual Speaker Series. Before we proceed to today's event, the University of Washington Smart Center would like to acknowledge that we live, learn, and work on the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people who walked here before us and those who still walk here. We are grateful to strive to respectfully live and work on these lands with the Coast Salish and Native people who call this home. And we encourage you to learn about the ancestral lands that you are joining us from as well. All right, so a little bit about our speakers series. We're so thrilled that we have nearly 100 folks with us today and counting. We've been doing the Smart Center Speaker Series since 2020. Our first two were in person on the campus at the University of Washington here in Seattle. And as we know, then starting in March 2020, subsequent talks were out of necessity virtual. We appreciate from our event surveys and other data that we have collected over the last few years that we can reach a broader and more diverse audience by keeping these events virtual. And so we will continue this tradition in 2023. This is our first event of 2023. And this is a year in which we are focusing on equity-centered, multi-tiered system of supports and school mental health. And so we hope that you will join us in April as well, when we will welcome Tanara Blount and Tiana Bilal, and in May when we will welcome Dr. Eddie Fergus, all of whom will be focused on the topic of equity in school mental health. And if you miss any of these, you can watch the recordings on our website, and the links will be shared in the chat box for those of you who would like to bookmark that. One other thing to acknowledge is our speaker series is made possible by a grant from the U.S. Department of Education's Institute of Education Sciences and is also sponsored by the School Mental Health Supplement of the Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, which we host here at the Smart Center. A little bit about the University of Washington School Mental Health Assessment Research and Training Center. We strive to be a national leader in promoting and actually making happen in schools effective strategies to promote student and staff well-being. We do this through research and evaluation, provision of training and technical assistance to schools and districts and entire states. Community partnership and outreach is something that undergirds all the work that we do. If you go to the next slide, you'll see a little cool little virtual, or I guess this has been a photoshopped effort to put a photo of our team recently gathering in person. This is probably only about half of the whole Smart Center. We have folks all over the country we work with at this point, sitting again, Photoshop fashion in front of in the quad at the University of Washington. But our group's overarching mission is to promote high quality, culturally responsive programming to meet the full range of social, emotional, and behavioral needs of all students. And again, we do this in several ways. We now, as a field, recognize, and we know this because we did the meta-analysis of many, many studies of where young people get their mental health services. And we learned from this that confirmed, in fact, that schools are the most common venue in which youth receive help in support of their mental well-being. So this is a critical task of the Smart Center. And we see our role in making positive change and achieving that mission as being threefold. Generating evidence by developing and testing school-based models that work. We mobilize that research and evidence through training and technical assistance and consultation. We have a very active training and technical assistance core here at the Smart Center. And finally, we attempt to build political will and hospitable policies and funding by informing policymakers about how to make effective school mental health and MTSS happen in support of all K-12 students. This is a little bit about how the Smart Center attempts to achieve its mission. You can always, we'll keep up here for 1 second. If you'd like to do the QR thing, you can go to our website. You can also find us on the web at UW Smart. You can email us at uwsmart@uw.edu or Google Smart Center, University of Washington, and I'm sure you'll find us. Okay, last notes before we turn it over to our speaker. Smart Center does host the Northwest School Mental Health Training and Technology Transfer Center. And the MHTTC supports the mental health workforce in Alaska, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. We invite you to reach out to us. You can go find an incredible array of resources on the website of the Northwest portion of the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, sponsored by SAMHSA. So we invite you to join us, our community of practice, and view our many resources. Okay, at long last, I am very pleased to introduce Dr. Nicole Y. Hollins-Sims. Her presentation is entitled Transformative Systems Through Equity, and I love this part of the title. What are your powers? I often have to think about how best to tap into the powers that I have to try to make change for young people. And I hope that this presentation will help everybody think about a couple ways in which you can use your powers in service of promoting equity and positive outcomes for our students. So Dr. Hollins-Sims is an educational consultant and strategist. She currently serves as a technical assistance coordinator for the Midwest PBIS network. She's a former special assistant to the Secretary of Education at the Pennsylvania Department of Education. And she's previously served as an educational consultant for the Pennsylvania Training and Technical Assistance Network in the Harrisburg office, where she was the co-statewide lead for the Learning Environment and Engagement Initiative. Dr. Hollins-Sims is a Pennsylvania certified school psychologist and has conducted research around caregivers of children of incarcerated parents and their motivation to engage in family-school partnerships. Dr. Hollins-Sims has been awarded a Moral and Courageous Leader for Education Award by Cabrini University in 2021, the 2021 American Psychological Association Anti-Racism School Psychology Emerging Professional Award, and was named the 2021 Pennsylvania School Psychologist of the Year. In 2022, Dr. Hollins-Sims served as the lead author of the book titled Creating Equitable Practices in PBIS. And finally, Dr. Hollins-Sims has recently launched her own business, Hollins-Sims Consultation. And with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Nicole Hollins-Sims.
Thank you, Dr. Burns. I appreciate you, and I appreciate the team at the Smart Center for giving me this opportunity to speak to some new folks that might be in my new stratosphere on the West Coast. And it was awesome to hear that there are people from across the country that are represented here. When Dr. Graffin-Reed reached out to me and said, would you want to do this? I had no idea that we would get this many people interested. And that just is a testament to the work that's being done at the Smart Center and really tapping into the needs of the field and ensuring that we are talking about the most effective practices possible. So I'm honored and privileged to be a part of this amazing speaker series. When I think about what's coming in April with my friends from the School District of Philadelphia, you're really tapping into PA, and I love it. And also Dr. Eddie Fergus in May. It's amazing. And so I'm honored to be among them. And so I'm excited to get started. I am going to try my best to keep to time. I can talk a lot about this topic, but I do want to be clear that I know I have a hard stop so that we can get your questions answered. So Dr. Graffin-Reed is definitely probably going to pull the hook out. If she says it's time, it will be time. So I'm going to do my best, and keep in mind that I'm on East Coast time. So if she gives me that time shout out, I may have to do calculations in my head, but nevertheless, Very happy to be with all of you. And one thing that I want to talk about are transformative systems and how you can do that through an equity mindset. And this concept of what are your powers, I think sometimes when we talk about this term equity, inclusion, belonging, diversity, all of these big terms, we can sometimes feel overwhelmed by them and wonder, what can I do about that? You have some powers, and I hope that after today you can recognize what they are. So let's get started. Okay, so you were able to hear my bio. I'm not going to rehash the bio, but I always like to kind of open up sessions where I speak to people, allowing them the opportunity to get to know me a little bit better. And so first and foremost, there are some things personally that I would love to share. One is that I'm a wife to Ron. We're going on 7 years. And for some of us, 7 means a perfect number. And I'm hopeful for that. I'm a mommy to CJ. He is 5 and he'll be starting kindergarten next year. And so right now, mommy is a little bit stressed on what that will look like for him. Part of the reason, actually one of the biggest reasons I do this type of work is because I think of kids like him that will be entering an educational system and what that could look like for him. I want him to keep that same joy and energy that he has now about learning. And I had to transform systems to do it. And I know you'll join me. I'm an IUP. If you're not from Pennsylvania, that may feel foreign to you. Indiana University of Pennsylvania is where I earned my doctorate degree. And I also went to Millersville University to get my specialist degree for school psychology, as well as my undergrad time. So both of those state schools have been near and dear to my heart. I'm a former cheerleader. If you can't tell, I'm trying not to get too overly excited, but I always enjoy getting to be around people and talking to them about good work. So I am going to do my best to encourage you as we work together today. Who did I want to be when I grew up? Janet Jackson. Who do I still want to be when I grow up? Janet Jackson. And I know you heard Marvin Gaye at the top of our session today. I have to give a shout out to my family, who I hope is tuning in right now. My mom and dad definitely brought me up on Motown, and I can remember Friday nights cleaning the house and we would listen to things like What's Going On. And so that song has special meaning because it came out in 1971, but as you could hear in the lyrics, still very applicable today. Janet Jackson is one of those people for me too. I'm going to date myself a little bit. When she released the album Rhythm Nation in 1989, the lyrics of that song gave me a what's going on feel, that we have the power to make change, but we have to recognize what is really happening in our current climate, in our current culture. And so she always has had a special tie to me, and I continue to be very admirable of her. Finally, I'm a Disney fanatic. And so as we think about what your powers are, the Disney connection is going to come to life a little bit, not so much Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck, but the Marvel universe. And if I have any Marvel fans in the house, you'll have a ball today. And if you're not someone who has watched Marvel, I hope that what I talk about has some meaning for you as well. So how do we transform systems with an equity mindset? One of my good friends, Dr. Kent McIntosh from the University of Oregon, he talks about how sometimes we talk about this work in the mindset of a lens. How do I look at things with an equity lens, et cetera? I think we have to rethink that. And he says this same thing. A lens is something we can take off and on, just like glasses, contact lenses, et cetera. A mindset is something very different. A mindset has transformative powers that allows us to approach things in a very different way. And that's what I'm hoping we can do today. But I always have to start here because I don't take it for granted that we all have the same understanding, the same interpretation of language. So right at the onset, I want to say that language matters. And so I have to start with one that is so important to this work. What is equity? Now, if I were to go Zoombox to Zoombox, and I see we have over 100 plus people on today, your definition may be different than someone else that's maybe sitting next to you or in a state across the way from you. But we have to think about at the anchor what equity really means. And this is by no means to say that this definition is the best one or this definition is what should be used. This is the definition that I have been subscribing to in my work in Pennsylvania. And it really goes along with what comes out of the organization called CCSSO, which essentially is an organization that brings together commissioners, secretaries of education from across the country. And they combined and said, what could we do to articulate what equity means? And so in Pennsylvania, we adopted this definition. Every learner has access. And originally, when this definition was adopted in PA, access is where we stopped. Every learner has access to educational resources and rigor they need at the right moment in their education across, and you can see the litany of identities that are provided: ethnicity, religion, language, gender identity, sexual orientation, family background, family income, etc. As we kept talking to folks in the field, the one thing that came up was that access was simply not enough. We had to add this component of and opportunity. Every learner has access and opportunity to those educational resources and rigor they need at that right moment. Why did we add that? I'm glad you asked. So when we think about opportunity, I want us to go back into our time travel gear, and let's go back to 2020, March 2020. I can speak for Pennsylvania. March 13th, 2020 is when our schools had to shut down immediately. And at that moment, school districts around our state had to pivot very quickly and get devices into the hands of learners to say, we still want you to actively participate in the learning that we're going to offer now virtually in a very different platform, different manner. And even with us giving out those devices, whether it was a Chromebook or an iPad or what have you, we gave access, but we still had a number of students who were sitting in the school parking lot to get Wi-Fi, sitting in the McDonald's parking lot to get Wi-Fi. So even though access was available, opportunity to participate was not. And so that's how we have to think about equitable practices being not only accessible, but offering opportunity for people to leverage the access they're being given. It also lends itself, when we think of that right moment is how we can articulate multi-tiered systems of support. How do we know what the right moment is if we aren't looking at the data through a very equitable mindset to say, who needs what when? And that's where the tiered support system affords us that opportunity as well. So as we unpack that definition, that's why language is so important. There are a lot of people and places where you can't say the word equity. I want to try to dismantle some of maybe the misunderstanding or misperception that might be out there about this term. Talking about access to Wi-Fi is universal, and it really lends itself to the multitude of identities that we all walk in with, not just one. We all could identify with 1, 2, maybe even 4 or 5 that are listed here. So in schools, how is this possible? And you can see we always have some type of graphic to depict what equity should look like. I like this one because it paints the picture of a school. And you can see equality, everyone getting the same thing. That's not going to allow every student to have the access and opportunity to be successful. Whereas equity on the right-hand side shows us that when students are given what they need, they now have that access and opportunity. And while that sounds simple, and we know it's not, that's the goal overall. So what does the field say? Interestingly, when I've been doing this work, and I would say now I'm at maybe 6 to 7 years of being very steeped in the work of equity, inclusion, and belonging, these are some of the things that I would hear when I would do trainings. One would be, equity does not apply to me. We are a rural district. We don't have racial diversity. And sometimes I would have to unpack that and say, why is there this thought that when we talk about equity, it's only about racial diversity? I had to sit in that for a while. And then I had to wonder, is there connotation that because I identify as a person of color, that I have to be talking about race whenever I talk about equity? Those hidden identities may not be as noticeable. And so what I've had to do when unpacking that is to really spend time on that definition that we just did. Because no matter where you are, rural, suburban, or urban, equitable practices are still very much important. You have students with disabilities. You have students from low to high socioeconomic status. All of those things coexist in a lot of students. So equity is still going to be valid and relevant. This is just a new buzzword. That's what I was hearing in 2017, 2018. Then it became even more of a buzzword in 2020. And now it's almost taboo to say in some places. So again, how do we make it relevant? This is one we hear all the time. And as I think about the work that the SMART Center does, as it ties to mental health, as it ties to trauma-informed practices, I've been in situations where people have said, we aren't doing equity, we're focused on trauma and mental health, as if those things aren't co-connected, as they should be. If we're doing equitable practices, we're giving someone who may have a mental health challenge, who may have had a trauma experience, what they need to be successful. That's the true definition of equity. And this last one, oh my goodness, here's one more thing. Where can I get this training so I can check it off? Yeah, that happens a lot. And I'm going to be very transparent with all of you. This has happened to me on more than one occasion. And in that one occasion that it was a little bit more noticeable than others is when I was asked to come and speak to a school district in my state. So you guys in Washington are off the hook, but in my state, to do a kickoff, you know, that opening of the school year where the teachers are returning and they want to get everyone excited to jumpstart the next school year. I was brought in to do that. And when I was asked to come, I was told that they needed to review my materials, they needed to check on my PowerPoints, et cetera. And as we were sitting at the table, really preparing for this day, the assistant superintendent said to me, you know, Nicole, we do understand that we brought in the cliche Black chick to talk to us about equity. And it was at that moment that I recognized that this was just a checkbox for them. Because number one, I was seen as cliche. And then to throw in Black chick to sort of bring me down a notch, to let me know this is what you're here for. It was an interesting dynamic, to say the least, but it said so much in that one moment. And I always get this question, well, did you actually do the session? I did do the session because I felt if people were comfortable enough to say that to me as someone who was being perceived as an expert in the field, what were they saying to people that looked like me, that were sitting in their desk or that were working in their buildings? And so I felt an obligation to speak for those that couldn't. So that's what the field has been saying. And I could probably make a whole new list now, but we just need to know that this work is not out of our hands. We do have the potential to make this work transformative. I won't belabor this, but I do want to highlight that for me, and I think for a lot of my colleagues, we almost see this demarcation mark of 2020 on. So some people say pre-COVID, post-COVID. I like to say pre-2020, post-2020, because at that point, things really did shift. Whether they were for good or not, a spotlight really showed on this list that you see on the left. Those inequities, educational inequities that are listed there, they didn't just begin pre-2020. They began pre-fill in the century. When schools first were being established, inequities existed, and they continued across time. The spotlight in 2020 gave us a new charge to reimagine. How many of us heard the words reimagine education? And yet, in a lot of systems, we've reverted back. How can we do better? That's what I'm hoping today's session will talk about. I want to unpack just a couple of these. So societal inequities are the things that, again, society is shaping in how we view certain people and what we think certain people have the capability to do. So when we think of deficit mindsets, societal inequity can be a part of that. I'm not going to go one by one, but let's spend some time on staffing towards the bottom. Right now, I can speak again for Pennsylvania. We are in crisis when it comes to needing substitutes, bus drivers, cafeteria workers. I'm sure many other states can relate. Staffing has been an issue prior to 2020 and the pandemic. But what did staffing inequity look like? It looked like having the highest qualified teacher not in front of the most neediest student. Remember that picture where we had the boxes? Everyone was getting the same thing, but not in the way that it needed to happen for true equity to exist. And then assessment inequity. I'm going to spend just a little minute right here. As a former practicing school psychologist, when I used to be able to give IQ assessments, and I know across the country there's different methods to identify a student with a special education eligibility. But when I was doing it, and I'm going to date myself again, I gave what was called the WISC-4, which was an intelligence test. And I compared that intelligence test to an achievement test, at that time, the Wyatt. Back to the IQ measure, that WISC-4. One of the subtests was called What's Missing. And in that subtest, there used to be a picture, and the student was asked to identify what was missing in the picture. And then they were scored based on the response that they offered. And I remember giving this test, I would say 2006, 2007, and asking a young person to look at a rotary phone and tell me what was missing. They had no idea what was missing. The correct answer was the cord. And so for some of us that are probably 80s and 70s babies, even more, we knew exactly what was missing. But for students, young people in 2006, 2007, as we're starting to move into iPhones, a rotary phone was not familiar at all. I tell you that story because I, as a clinician, was assessing and determining perhaps a trajectory for a student with a test that was inherently biased. So assessment inequity didn't just begin at 2020. That's the point we're illustrating here. So I just want us to be clear as we move forward about what are our powers. They've been inside of us. It's now being able to recognize them and put them into practice. Historical context. There's a great friend of mine named Dr. Ronald Whitaker who offers that when we think about equitable practices, we need a framework. And the framework that he offers is called HELP, H-E-L-P. H is for history. The old adage of if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it is what he's talking about. And so I offer this historical context. I also offer this to you as a power to consider. Know the history not only of education globally, nationally, statewide, locally. Know the history of your school building. What has been tried before? What hasn't worked before? What could you have thought about differently had you known that information? That's historical context that then helps you across the framework. Let me give you the rest of the framework first. H is history. E is equality versus equity. Think of that picture. L is love. And not love like marriage love or boyfriend, girlfriend love. Love in the sense of relationships. Love for the work, love for the people we're serving. And then P is pedagogy and practices. And in the work that we do, we like to jump right to P, right? We're helpers. We want to get things done, but we need the H, the E, and the L to get there. So let me go to historical context. I'm not going to belabor this, but I want you to see the timeline of where we've been in America related to education and how that has perpetuated some of those inequities that we see. I can remember in the 90s, cultural competence was the thing. We now know that proficiency, cultural humility, those are the things that we focus on now. But even in the 21st century, are we there yet? And I know there are many people on here right now who say no. We have a long way to go still, but we're beginning to unpack how to get there. So the first step is really, what's the story? And in that sense, disproportionality can tell us a story. It can give us the information on who's getting what they need, who's not, and why not, and are they getting it at that right moment for them to be successful? I want us to understand that disproportionality is complex. There's no one part about disproportionality that lends itself to it. There are many factors that contribute. And just to highlight a couple, discipline policies and practices. For instance, zero tolerance, or policies that are specific without us sometimes even knowing that impact a certain group more than another. Those policies and practices can really, really ramp up disproportionate outcomes. We could go through all of these. I won't for the sake of time, but I just want us to be clear that there's so much that contributes to disproportionality that we have to take inventory of ourselves. In the book that I've written, I talk about self-awareness and system awareness. Self-awareness is that introspective work we do to see how we may contribute to some of this. System awareness is the process that we collectively need to do to see how we contribute to disproportionality. And so this is one of the ways that we can start to do both that self and system awareness component. It's called the Cultural Proficiency Continuum, and it comes from the book Cultural Proficiency for School Leadership. As I go through this, what you'll notice is on the left-hand side, there's an arrow that goes up and down. It's bright red. Essentially, that arrow is there to say, none of us live at the top of proficiency. Let me just show you these just so we can have a sense. None of us live at proficiency 24/7. We all ebb and flow, move up and down this continuum each and every day. That's where cultural humility really plays a part. So I'm just going to unpack again a couple of these so you can see when we're evaluating our systems, when we're evaluating ourselves, where are we situated with certain types of scenarios, certain types of interactions, etc. At the very bottom is cultural destructiveness. And the way that it's articulated is it's seeking to eliminate the cultures of others in all aspects. And you might say, well, what does that mean? How do we eliminate a culture? In society, from a global sense, this may be something like a genocide. In schools, this is how that sounds. You know, if we didn't have the special education students, our scores would be really high if they went to that other school. Seeking to eliminate something so that we, collective we, could have a better outcome. Or if we didn't zone our district this way and those kids that live in the projects went here, case in point. So those are the examples of destructiveness that you might see. Incapacity is trivializing or stereotyping other cultures, making comments off the cuff. These might be microaggressions, etc., that really may not really intend to hurt people, but the impact is still very much present and creates an atmosphere that's toxic and not really creating spaces of belonging for the people that are being served. I was recently informed, and so I'm also on this journey of up and down. And so I want to be very cognizant of it, including this process with you. Cultural blindness or color blindness is something that is referenced a lot. And I've had a colleague share that when we say blindness, that is very detrimental to people who are visually impaired. And so we were asked to think about shifting language to be cultural or color evasive instead. So my stuff, now that I know better, I'm going to do better, will now reflect cultural evasiveness. And in that sense, it's not noticing or acknowledging the culture of others and ignoring discrepant experiences. These are what we would call micro invalidations. There's also a reason why this sits in the middle, because oftentimes when people say, I don't see color, I don't see you for your disability, I don't see you for your gender, etc., a lot of times that intention is good. The goal is, I see you for who you are. I love you for who you are. It doesn't matter to me, all of those things. The issue with that is the impact part again. Because if I identify as one of those identities and you say you don't see it or you don't recognize it, then you've just pulled a piece of me away. So you don't fully embrace the full me if you can't see those things or understand those things. Important as we do self and system awareness. Let's move on. Cultural pre-competence, increasing awareness. So we're either moving in a constructive direction or we're faltering and stopping. I will honestly say, after 2020, maybe months into, I would say, the summer of 2020, when everybody started saying, let's do equity work in school districts, at least in my state, this is what I saw the most of. A want to do something different, a want to get something started, but not really knowing the directions to take. And if it didn't go well right away, they stopped. If enough people raised a stink about it, they stopped. Or some built their coalitions of the willing and moved forward. So pre-competence is what I was seeing a lot of. The same thing is when we celebrate Black History Month, Women's History Month, etc. They're all good things, but they're just not enough to get us to proficiency, right? Cultural competence, aligning our personal values to be inclusive of cultures that are new or different. We have healthy interactions. I would again say, I would shift this language from competence to humility, meaning I'm constantly in a learning space. I always want to know more because I don't know it all. And then cultural proficiency is the ultimate goal. If we talk about evaluation of staff members, we use the Danielson framework where I'm from, we would say that no one lives in distinguished. And the same applies here. No one lives in proficiency. It's the goal, it's where we want to get to, but we have to go through this continuum on a consistent basis. Now, I might be proficient in knowing what it means to be a woman, or knowing what it means to be a Black woman, but I can't speak for every Black woman, right? I'm proficient in my experience and the experiences of those like me. I have a lot to learn about different people, and that's the importance of this continuum. So I wanted to unpack that as we engage in self and system awareness. I'm going to keep moving because I want to get us to the powers piece. So once we have, and I have to laugh because we often, as educators, we think in shapes. And so with multi-tiered systems of support, I think of a triangle right away, or I think in circles in PBIS language. With belonging, people say, well, what is this belonging word that I keep hearing about? Imagine a triangle again. At the bottom base of that triangle, where all of your universal practices typically live, that's where equitable practices should be. The practices that allow for those boxes to be in different shapes and sizes and heights so that people are getting what they need. That should be foundational. In the middle of the triangle, the authors of the book, Belonging Through a Culture of Dignity, would say the next piece should be inclusion. Not the traditional inclusion that we hear when we talk about special education law, but inclusion in the sense of an inclusive community where inherent dignity is honored and worth is honored, human to human. I may not agree with everything you say. I may not be from the same place as you, but I can agree that we can have civil dialogue, equitable practices to set the foundation, moving up to inclusion. And then at the very tippy top, the goal again is belonging. That space where I can show up authentically as me. And so they offer this definition: experiencing appreciation, validation, acceptance, and fair treatment within an environment. Think of the last time you felt appreciated. Think of the last time you felt validated. Think of the last time you felt accepted and treated fairly. That's true belonging. And they offer this kind of part B to this definition that I always connect to. And I hope that as I read it, you also can think about this for yourself or for the learners that you serve. When people feel like they belong, they aren't distracted and worried about being treated as a stereotype or a singular part of their multidimensional personhood. That's heavy. And I sit in it every time I read it, because I can think of different instances where I was distracted and worried about, am I talking too loud? Am I coming off too aggressive? All the things that may be tied stereotypically to someone like me have consumed me at times. And then at the same time, I may have tried to shed a part of me, that multidimensional personhood, those multiple identities we carry, in order to fit in, so that I can be validated, I can be accepted. The goal of belonging is so that's not happening. That's not easy to achieve for every person, but it is the goal of transforming systems, is to get to that space of belonging. How can we do it? Our friends at Wisconsin RTI Center offered this graphic to remember. I told you we think in triangles and circles. So here we are. Here's a circle that really speaks to this. We have to have the will, the feel, and the skill. With MTSS, we often go from will to skill, the want to do something different, to build out our infrastructure of system, and the skill to do it, the application part. What we sometimes miss is the blue, which is gaining cultural knowledge about where we take our will, how we encourage and infuse the understanding and learning of cultural humility, and apply it in the skill that we do. So in the will part, we're becoming self-aware. We're doing that continuum work. We're examining our system, that self-awareness and system awareness. We're shifting our deficit mindset to be asset-based, that all students will learn, that there are unique identities and worldviews in our spaces, that we know the communities we're serving. And as we're transitioning out of blue and yellow, in the green, What are we actually putting into practice? We're leading, we're modeling, we're advocating, we're accepting that we haven't always got it right and we want to do better. And we're using practices and curriculum that respect the students that are seated in front of us, because they come with a variety of cultures, even if they all look alike. So let's keep that in mind. Remember that statement that I hear all the time, we don't have racial diversity. Why do we have to talk about this? Because there are cultures that exist among all of us in that multidimensional personhood. So as we keep moving, what is MTSS? I'm not going to spend a ton of time here, but I do want us to unpack and be clear on the language of what MTSS means and how we can apply equitable practices to it. It's that right moment, remember? So this definition I offer, again, not the end all be all definition. There are multitudes of definitions out there, but this gets at, to me, a very clear-cut understanding. Bottom line, multi-tiered system of support is proactive and preventative, and it's a framework. It's not a curriculum. It's not a strategy. It is a framework. The practices exist in the context of the framework. And the focus is on data, instruction. Instruction can be academic, social, emotional, and behavioral to maximize student achievement and to support those domains, social, emotional, behavioral, academic, from a strengths-based perspective. That's the goal. So as we tie that definition with the definition of equity, they nicely align. But where do we need equity? I often hear teams talk about equitable practices at tier 2, at tier 3. And I go, wait a minute, we're missing something here, because it needs to happen universally at tier 1. If we're not performing equitable practices at tier 1, it defeats that triangle I talked about with equity, inclusion in the middle, and belonging at the top. And how do we address tier 1? In Pennsylvania, we have this way of approaching MTSS through these 6 categories. Shared ownership, meaning a student that maybe is an English learner, or a student that has an IEP, doesn't just belong to Ms. Hollins. That student belongs to every staff member that he or she encounters. Shared ownership, the student's data means something to Ms. Hollins, to Ms. Graffenreid, to every person in that building. Universal screening, ensuring that we have an assessment to evaluate the health of our system. And so it's like the thermometer check. You know, when you go to the doctor and you get a physical and you get your weight checked, you get maybe your height checked, and the doctor doesn't do heart surgery based on those 2 assessments. The doctor says, now let's see what else we can do and what things you can do universally, change your diet, do more running, etc. We don't get more diagnostic until later. That's universal screening. Having a standards aligned core, being clear on the things that we want to achieve across the year, and making sure that they are developmentally appropriate, etc. Professional learning, things like what you're doing today, getting some information on how to do better. But what I would say is, let's not fall into an equity trap and trope that comes from the work of Jamila Dugan and the book Street Data. Don't make this a spray and pray. And I don't want to make this a spray and pray. I'm so happy this is a series, because you're going to build off of my session and then be with my friends from School District of Philly in April, and then be with Dr. Fergus in May, who's amazing. So there's an ongoing training, TA, availability, coaching, availability. That's what professional learning really means, not a one and done, right? Database decision-making, being able to look at all of the sources of data, which are not just numbers. They're stories, they're surveys, they're all types of anecdotes that help tell the story, right? And making decisions that align with what the data is telling us. And then family and community engagement. We can't do any of this work related to being equitable if we haven't heard from the people it impacts the most. And that's where family and community engagement is. It has to happen. As hard as it might be, we have to put ourselves in a position where we are creating opportunities for that. Okay, so moving from systems to classrooms, I've given you a very broad brush of what happens at the large scale level, but at the classroom level, what does this look like? Culturally relevant pedagogy, culturally responsive practices, equitable instruction. Remember those 3 domains: academic, behavioral, social, emotional. And to me, the biggest one, How can we learn if we don't have a safe and positive learning environment for these brave conversations to take place? And so our friends at the Center on PBIS have released a brief 2015 that is still very, very relevant, talking about how to use engaging instruction. We know that when instruction isn't engaging, our behaviors tend to ramp up. So what are the things we could do? And not only just do to see our behaviors decrease, but ensure that there is equitable access and opportunity in the classroom instruction. So for one, it's explicit instruction. And so there are questions that really lend themselves to this. So did I lead my students through it on their own? Building and priming background knowledge. In the brief, they have an example of this whole lesson around vocabulary, and the vocabulary lesson is about the beach. A lot of us may assume that every student we serve has been to the beach. We may need to build and prime background knowledge to ensure that based on the cultures and experiences of who we're serving, that we know that there's a shared understanding of those things. Increasing opportunities to respond, so high levels of engagement. And that might mean we have introverts in the classroom who don't want to be raising their hand all the time. They're more comfortable using a Kahoot or a Mentimeter, some other way to keep them connected. And that's just one example. And then providing performance feedback. Not everyone receives feedback in the same way. We may need to differentiate what that feedback looks like, whether that's written. Some students don't want someone to praise them in front of the entire class, especially sometimes if you come from a collectivistic culture where we're all collectively a team. If you single me out, that may be embarrassing, uncomfortable. So how do we make sure that feedback is appropriate? Those are just ways to think about the classroom as well. Quickly, equity in a tiered behavior framework. So now we're really on PBIS in the way that we can think about what each of these tiers looks like when equity is truly embedded. You've heard me say the importance of voice. Student voice is critical in this, especially at tier 1, when we're thinking about what are our expectations, what are our acknowledgement systems? Have we asked the students what might work for them? We can't assume that if we create a space where, let's say you earn enough that you can go and have lunch with the principal, that students want to do that. They may not. And if they don't, then your acknowledgement system really has no base. That the staff are engaging in self-awareness, that critical component that we know is necessary in this work. That the use of values and norms are really considered. There's some great activities that talk about elements of culture. So how I viewed profanity when I was younger, how I view profanity now, what the expectation or consequence around profanity is at my school that I'm serving, and then where there might be a disconnect between the families and the students that I serve and my experience. We've talked about acknowledgement systems. At tier 2, is there access? Or are all of our students kind of being shuffled to tier 3 without really being sure that they've had the opportunity to access tier 2? And with tier 2, have we layered on supports? Because sometimes the thought is they didn't do well in tier 1, so now let's do a tier 2 intervention, and we don't connect tier 1 to tier 2. That piece is important for equitable practices to occur. So instructional opportunities, this is dosage. This is what we talk about at the advanced tiers, increasing dosage with that foundational tier 1 in place. And then at tier 3, it's more individualized. How are we meaningfully including students and families that we ourselves are not determining the goals and the design of the intervention, but that students and families have had a say, that there's trust, two-way communication, that's the law with family engagement, and that we limit our assumptions on the home life of families and students. Easy for me to say, harder to put in practice. But if we can take that part out and ask ourselves, what is really within our control? We can focus on that and not on where they're from, whose father is who, all of the different things that we go down a rabbit hole, or what Nancy Love would call a downward spiral conversation. So what are the foundational elements? When we think about equity in a tiered system of support, there are many things that we could spend days on each one of these around. The Center on PBIS talks about a 5-point approach, and one of which I've already discussed, and that is the importance of data. with this particular case, we're highlighting discipline data, but we could extend that to what are called the ABCs: attendance, behavior, and course performance. That comes from the work of Belfonts out of Johns Hopkins University. And they talk about how important ABCs are to know how much a student may be close to dropping out. Early warning systems gives us that data, but if we only look at it through the aggregate, we won't have a sense of how the system is supporting or not supporting students that may come from a variety of identities and backgrounds. The disaggregated part is critical. We also have to think about implementing a preventative, multi-tiered, culturally responsive behavior framework. We can sub behavior for any other piece: academic, social, emotional, etc. Again, preventative in nature, culturally responsive in nature, understanding who we are as a system and who we ourselves are as we make up the components of the system. Using engaging instruction, which we just discussed, to reduce the opportunity gap. Looking at policies with accountability. So if there are policies like zero tolerance or policies around dress code, cell phone use that are really becoming something that's leading to disproportionate outcomes, we need to revisit them and say, is this the mountain we're willing to die on? Or could these policies be reviewed in a way that they're more responsive? Not to say consequences shouldn't occur, but are we missing the mark by being too punitive in nature on things that are just evolutionary in focus? Cell phone use is an example. Some may not agree with me, but there are some high schools that I've been in who said, we got rid of our cell phone policy because it was too much work to keep track of it. We figured we could focus on something else. That's not to say your building, you may need to, but in that particular case, that policy needed reviewed because certain students were receiving the outcomes as opposed to others. Teaching strategies for neutralizing implicit bias and discipline decisions. Again, we could spend a day training on this, but this concept of we have ideas about certain people. If I said peanut butter, many of you would say jelly. We have these automatic associations that happen in our brain at a consistent basis. And so when we interact with different people, our brains are doing that automatic association, and that's where implicit bias tends to happen. So I'll share a brief example. As I grew up, my mom was a teacher. I didn't get to share her story. I would have loved to, but she was a teacher. And so when I was a student, there were certain things that she really drilled into me that were important. One of which was you never fall asleep in class because that's seen as disrespectful. So when I'm training or when I've been in front of a classroom doing a social skills lesson or something of that sort, and a student falls asleep, I have a trigger that makes me say they're disrespecting me. My implicit bias is kicking in, and a lot of times my reaction would be negative. And in that negative reaction, it would be, let's move to fix it, whether it was a write-up, whether it was an interaction that may not have been too great. How do I neutralize that? I have to ask myself some questions. Number one, I have to say, is this a me thing or is this really a student thing? Does the student fall asleep all the time? Are they up all night because they're working all night? All of these different questions that help me neutralize that implicit bias that may lead to an outcome that's not positive. Those are foundational elements. And so I really try to, in this time that I've had, give you foundational pieces of what equitable practices could and should look like so that we can achieve belonging. And now I'm going to move us into those powers. Remember, the title is, what are your powers? So how can you transform your universe? This is where Marvel comes in. So I want you to strap on your seatbelts because I'm going to take you on a ride through the Marvel universe. And I'm going to paint a picture for you. If you're not a Marvel fan, I'm a Marvel fan because my 5-year-old, when we were quarantined in COVID, I had to watch the Marvel timeline. Now, he was 3 at the time. I had to watch the Marvel timeline from beginning to end. Now, my husband, before we got married, he used to watch them all the time. And I would say, I don't want to watch that. That's silly. My son made me watch it, and now I'm hooked. And so now, because I'm hooked, you're going to be hooked too, I hope. But my goal here is to make this not light, but something that you can remember so that when you're in the trenches and something tries to, knock you off and you say, I can't do this anymore, I want you to think about your powers. So how can you transform your universe? Anyone who knows the movie, there is a big villain. His name is Thanos. Thanos was on a quest to go through the Marvel universe and find what he called Infinity Stones. These Infinity Stones had different powers. And the Infinity Gauntlet is what you see in front of you. It's like a glove that you put on. Thanos would put it on, and when he would have all of those stones that he collected, he could snap his fingers. And when he snapped, 50% of the universe disappeared. Now, while I'm not asking you to make people disappear, what I'm asking you to do is recognize that the power of that snap with these Infinity Stones completely shifted the universe and the atmosphere. I want you to put on your gauntlets right now as we move ahead. The first stone is the yellow stone. It's the Mind Stone. And so I want you to ask yourself these questions. What's your why? Why do you get up every day to come to this job? Why do you get up every day to work with students? Why do you get up every day to talk about mental health? Why? What is it for you? And as you think about your personal why, what is our collective why? Have we sat down and really unpacked our mission, our vision, and our ultimate goals? And if we haven't, why not? Because that's always what we can anchor ourselves back to. When there is opposition, and I've said this to school districts who have faced opposition on the work they're trying to do, what does your mission and vision say? And can you tie everything you're doing back to it? Because if you can, it's really hard to say that this work doesn't have purpose for every learner in your building. So what is your why? Using that Mind Stone, what will keep you anchored when the going gets tough? The next one is the Space Stone, Blue Stone. You have to be able to assess the landscape. What are the conditions? What's that data story? Have we disaggregated our data? And how do we establish foundations? What are the core components that we may have missing? There are fidelity measures that help us know that. And once that's there, have we put some solid rock in place so that we can continue to build up those tiers or build up that infrastructure? We have to assess the landscape, and that's what the Space Stone allows us to do. So if you're keeping tally, I want you to remember these different stones and think about which stone or stones you have had work so far, and which stones you may need some more work on. The Mind Stone was what is our why. The Space Stone is what is the landscape. How do we also assess? Audit tools can help us. So there are a lot of audit tools that I've seen across the country that really get at this, knowing, what's working, what's not working through our current system. And this determines who have we not spoken to that we really need to engage with. Remember that family and community engagement component? So critical. How do we find and determine our priorities? Because the elephant may feel very, very big when we do this audit. How do we narrow the focus enough that we have some manageable priorities? And with that prioritization, what's our roadmap then? What are the steps that we're going to take that is very doable and manageable, SMART goals? What have we established through that process? That goes along with Space Stone. And essentially ask ourselves the question, how can we be data rich and information rich? Because the adage is we are data rich, but information poor. We have so much at us, we don't even know what to do with it. George Bash from the University of South Florida, he says equity is access, equity is process, and equity is outcomes. So remember, access is one part of it. Process is where we take the data that we have, the access data that we have, and say, how could we do this differently? And now let's look at the outcomes to see if we've made a dent. Access, process, and outcomes. And so the data story is critical. Nancy Love offers this graphic, which I think illustrates this beautifully. We have the data on one side of this proverbial bridge that really centers itself on collaborative inquiry. And if you haven't spent time understanding collaborative inquiry, I would highly encourage you to do it. It's asking these questions. You're like a toddler. Why? Why are we seeing what we're seeing? How can we do better? But the only way that we can have a space that's safe enough to engage in that type of inquiry is to start with leadership and capacity Structured collaboration, being clear on what it is we're focusing on, using the data frequently, and then seeing how we're improving instruction, academically, behaviorally, social, emotionally. The bridge is undergirded with school culture, our trust amongst each other on the team, and equity being centered. Professional development is sometimes needed, not sometimes, all the time needed, across this bridge as we move to get to results. That's important as we assess, again, the landscape and get that story. What's the next stone? The purple one. I love the purple one. It's power. Remember, I talked about what's in your control, what's not in your control. Focus on your power, the power that you have internally, the power that you have to impact externally, but not change the external, because we don't have control over that necessarily in some of our cases. Who is your volunteer army? Meaning, who are the people that you can definitely rely on to spread this message that you're trying to put in place around equity, around belonging, around inclusion, around MTSS? Who is your coalition of the willing? The people who have said, I'm on this train with you, Nicole. I may not fully understand it yet, but I'm going to ride this train with you and I'm ready to go. Do we share power? So I can remember being at the table at a lot of IEP team meetings, and the parents would sit on one side of the meeting, or the families would sit on one side of the meeting, and all of the educators would sit on the other. Already we've created a power dynamic where we're outnumbering them. So are we sharing that power? We talked about that in the tiers. Are we engaging with families and communities in a way that allows for that power to be exhibited and leveraged and utilized? There are some that would call this radical inclusion, meaning I'm not just listening for the sake of listening to you, but I'm actually going to take what you say and put it in practice. And that really lends itself to intentionally seeking buy-in or believe in. I'm really moving away from the term buy-in because I need you to believe in this. I need you to believe that it's important, that it's going to make change. And I've had a colleague who said, it's not just buy-in, it's collective commitment, because you can opt out of buying in, right? So power is important. And that purple stone is going to do it. So one of the things that's important is this guiding coalition. Because you may say, when you talk about volunteer army and coalition of the willing, what do you mean? It really comes from 8 Steps for Leading Change from Cotter. And he talks about this coalition of people that are born of its own ranks, that guide, coordinate, and communicate its activity. So these are the people that can go out and speak the language you're speaking and make it clear that we're all on the same page. This may be families. This may be a cultural broker, a community partner, teachers, principals, systems level thinkers who see the value in the work you're doing. That's part of your power stone. Who else can do it? Your teams. So you may have a district MTSS team, global district team that sort of articulates what should be happening at each of the school level buildings cohesively. Your core MTSS teams, which if we think of a cascade approach, this is definitely that. State level, district level, core. Then at the grade level teams, what does that look like? 5th grade, when you're looking at your data, how does that feedback loop get back to the core team? Similarly, what does that loop look like going back to the district team? And then the advanced tiers team. And you may call it a bunch of different things from state to state, from district to district, et cetera, region to region. But essentially, these teams become that guiding coalition, that volunteer army. Families can also do this. And so when we look at, again, a triangle, what does this look like with family school partnerships? So at Tier 1 universally, families become co-supporters, co-communicators. The people who are just like, yep, I'm at this meeting. I want to know more about what you're doing for everyone in the space. I support the efforts at home, et cetera. Tier 2, where we get a little bit more nuance, now families might become co-learners. If you're doing a modified check-in, check-out, or an instructional group on social, emotional, behavioral wellness, how can I, as a mom, learn what my child is doing in that intervention and also do it too at home? Same thing, Tier 3. Individualized. Now, as a family member, I'm a co-teacher because I'm now telling the school what does work at home, if it's not already happened before. But now I'm really in a position to say, these are the things that we do at home. They work. help me so we can collaborate. And then at that point in tier 3, where we're making decisions about next steps, I, as a mom, am now very much active in that decision-making. That's the goal of building that volunteer army as well. There's no one outside of the army. It's how do we pull people in, right? And so when we think about the definition of family school partnerships, it's really focused on cooperation, coordination, and collaboration. Families and professionals doing those 3 C's. In addition, we have 4 A's. So what are best practices that, as it relates to being engaging with families and communities? It's our approach, the tone that we use, the manner that we set up family school relationships. Do we want families at the table? And why do we say the table? It's our table, right? Have we created that atmosphere for them? That's the 3rd one, where there's a climate where we're welcoming you physically and emotionally. The attitude. If we have any underlying feelings or emotions about families that are coming in, or if families have those same feelings about us, some people who have been students in some schools never want to return to those buildings when they have children in their same schools. Why? When we think about atmosphere too, let's think about the first people we meet when we come to a school. It might be the school secretary, it might be a school security guard, it might be the principal. And if when I walk in, the comment is, what do you want now? Or give me a minute, it's crazy in here. Am I welcomed? Those are all things that influence the actions. The actions are the strategies and practices on how we bring people together. If those 4 A's are not cohesive and connected, we're not going to get the family and community engagement we need to drive equitable practices. Pardon me. The next stone is time, right? We all know we need this time stone the most. It feels like there's just never enough time for us to do any of this. So we have to be clear, what are manageable action steps that we can realistically achieve? On the flip though, what is our sense of urgency? It feels like, it's hard to balance the two because they're both important. What can we realistically do, but what's also urgent and at the top of mind? The time stone is going to help us make those decisions. The space stone helps us make those decisions. The power stone and the mind stone help us make those decisions. All important in this timepiece. So Dr. Fergus is probably going to talk about this because I was able to get this from the book that he wrote about disproportionality. Amazing, amazing work to give you a map of what this could look like when you think of time. Identify your starting place. He posits, has there been a root cause analysis in the last 2 to 3 years? Meaning, have you taken a deep dive as to why you're seeing what you're seeing? And in that root cause process, did you look at both qualitative and quantitative data? Have you monitored this work? Because one thing to keep in mind, work around equity, inclusion, belonging, all of it, MTSS, systems change in general. Ideally, it takes 3 to 5 years. If there's turnover of administrators, 7 to 10. So being in it for the long haul, that time stone is critical. And then progress monitoring tools. Are we doing what we said we would do? Are we making the progress that we are hoping to make? And I've included a calendar from our friends at the Wisconsin RTI Center that helps us to know how to evaluate that progress over time, every month, ideally. So that's the building of the plan on how to leverage that time stone in a way that's not overwhelming. Now, the reality stone. That all sounded good, Dr. Holland Sims. Sounds easy, but in reality, we got this going on, that going on. How do you expect us to do all this, right? Well, first we have to acknowledge our reality. And the first question I ask is, what are your roadblocks? What are the things that you can name that will get in your way? And it could be a noun, people, place, or thing, right? What are your roadblocks? And with that naming of them, as you chart them out, what needs adjusted as a result of them? Because I've had colleagues share with me, if you can predict it, you can prevent it. So if you can predict what those roadblocks will be, How do you prevent or adjust as needed? And as a result of that, we need to consistently circle back to the question of how are the youth and staff doing? There's an old Maasai saying, whenever they greet each other, this is an African tribe, they say, how are the children? Because if the children are well, then everyone else is well. This same question could apply. How are the youth and staff doing? Are they doing okay? And if not, what needs adjusted? And are the roadblocks really roadblocks that are insurmountable, or are they things that we have some power over? Remember that purple stone. The last stone is my favorite. Color-wise, purple and green are my favorite. But as far as what the stone represents, this one is mine, the soul stone. I would love for every one of us to be considered the soul of their team. I was honored when someone told me that when I was a teammate. You are the soul of our team. You are the heart of our team. I want you all to be that too. So the soul stone asks the questions, are we seeing the outcomes we value? Not just the outcomes we want, but the ones that we know are important for outcomes to be long lasting. Is our atmosphere shifting? Remember, as we snap our fingers, are we seeing the shift happen in our system? Coming back to how are the children? What are the students saying? If we were to go and ask them at random, what's your favorite thing about attending this school? Could they say it and feel that sense of belonging? Or could they say, I don't feel like I belong here? Data to help us know we're not doing something all the way right. How are families and communities responding? They're a part of that collective piece, right? We got to ask them that same question. And at the end of the day, are we fulfilling our mission and vision? Can we come back together and say, yep, we are doing the right thing. People are responding. We are living out, as I say in the work I do, I'm dreaming out loud. We are dreaming out loud and seeing our mission and vision fulfilled. That's the soul stone. And so I want to give you this graphic that I've used in other trainings that I think is helpful as we consider MTSS as a framework that's really data-based decision-making with this concept of engaging families and communities. This comes from the Austin Independent School District in Texas, and it focused on equity-focused decision-making. They call it level 1. And they go through this map, if you will, of 4 steps. And I love the language that they use here because they don't call it the table. They call it the decision-making table. Right there, it shifts the lens, right? The decision-making table implies, as you can see in the graphic under number 1, circular. We're all in the same level of power here, in decision-making power. And so there are some key questions to consider. Are diverse people and perspectives represented with power and agency? Is it safe to disagree? I've been in meetings, you've probably been in meetings where you were quiet because you weren't sure if what you said would set off another conversation or if you would experience something that could be triggering or upsetting. And so you just were quiet. A lot of families feel that way. A lot of educators feel that way. How do we create spaces where it's safe to disagree? Who's been silenced, muted, or ignored? Who haven't we heard from? And why haven't we heard from them? Which cultures and ways of communicating are dominant and valued? If we have people who see the school as the expert, so they're more reserved in letting the decisions come from the school, how do we acknowledge that that might be cultural? And think of alternative ways of engaging them. They may not feel comfortable in a group setting, in a meeting, expressing themselves, but they might feel comfortable if you're at a community center outside of the school, or if there's an opportunity to write in what they think. Being open to flexibility in the decision-making table. What problems are we trying to solve for whom and by when? So identifying the groups who are definitely not being represented, who have been predictably and systemically oppressed by current policies and practices. That's where that policy review comes in. Persistently centralizing those lived experiences, the strengths and the needs of students that come from underserved communities. We have to think about how we center them in these conversations. Number 3 is, does this solution actually work? Because we may have a million thoughts on what could work. and we put it in place and we're like, yeah, we did something. We shifted things. But did we really? And are the outcomes pointing to that? We don't know unless we ask. There's a book called Evident Equity. And in that book, they say, get proximate. So we may have these thoughts and ideas, but if we haven't gotten proximate to the people that are most impacted, we're going to keep cycling through, as we would call boomerang equity, cycling back to status quo, cycling back to the things that we always did because they tend to work for us, right? And meaningfully communicate with and engage people who are most adversely affected. Absolutely. And so as we think about number 4, what are the plans for ongoing data collection, analysis, being very public about our progress or lack thereof? And what course corrections are we going to take once we know better? And so this really lends itself to being accountable for equitable outcomes. That's the crux of all this work, of being social justice leaders. It's ensuring that we may not always get it right, but we're willing to come back to the decision-making table and be clear on what we could have done better, and then put those things in place and be responsive to what we're hearing. And so as we start to wrap up, I want you to really sit and think about, which powers does your system hold right now? And it may not be multiple, it may be one. You may be the soul stone, right? Your team may be right in that soul stone. We want to do something different, and our minds are clear, our mind stones at work. You know, we want to really focus on being clear on our why, on our mission, our vision. We want to shift the system, but reality is creeping in, time is creeping in. We haven't leveraged those well. We don't really know how to use our power, and our space stone, we still need to work on. That's all okay. I want to normalize that for you. But I also want you to be proactive and positive and think about which stone you're doing well. That's my goal for you today. And so when these powers come together, as we think of Marvel and my friends that you see up there, the Avengers, your universe and your system can be transformed. And just like Thanos, I'm not asking you to be a villain, but I want you to transform your system. And so I want you, with your soul stone, your mind stone, your infinity stones, to snap your fingers and shift your atmosphere. Those are your powers. And so if there are any follow-up questions, I know we're going to have Q&A momentarily, but also know that you can reach out to me at any time. You can follow me on Twitter at Dr. Nicole H. Sims. Please do not hesitate. I hope that this time was very helpful. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Graffin-Reed.
Well, Dr. Holland Sims, I am speechless. I was thinking about my powers and the colors, and our colleague, Dr. Jessica Swain-Bradway, says it best: you rock. You absolutely do. Thank you so much for really centering us into knowing that we do have a power. We have power, but we have to do some self-reflection and understanding where we can contribute. But I loved it as an educator, school psych, and as a mama. Part of it is we have to center ourselves so that we can bring folks to the table. Not invite them to our table, but to the table where we will collectively make decisions. And so I'm just so excited for hearing you today. And I'm looking at the comments. I don't know if you can see them. People are saying, thank you for your time and the info. We have a Q&A where you can pose a question into it, and we can have Dr. Nicole Holland Sims answer that question. While we're waiting for some questions to come in, I want to let you guys know that Dr. Holland Sims will be the keynote presenter at the Association of Positive Behavior Supports Conference, which will be held in Florida. Dr. Holland Sims, remind me, because Jacksonville, because my husband is on his way to a conference in Florida, but it's not Jacksonville. And so I have Gainesville, but it's Jacksonville. And so she will be kicking off that conference at the end of March.
Yes.
It will be our keynote presenter. So you guys got a taste of Dr. Holland Sims for my favorite price point, $3.99.
$3.99.
$3.99, our favorite. Let's see. Oh, yes. And if you are there, if you plan to attend APBS in Florida, please wear green, which is Dr. Holland Sims' favorite color. I unfortunately will not be in attendance, which is why you see me wearing my green today, because it is her favorite color. Do we have any questions? Just more thanks. People are just giving you great love, Dr. Nicole.
Awesome.
Yes, you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. One person says, thank you for this. I'm in my studies to be a school counselor, and this is given perspective. Yes, I love it when we can plant seeds and wait for them to take full bloom and impact our students.
Awesome.
I do want to say, Dr. Bruns mentioned that this is being broadcast throughout the country, and we have participants from around the country. I am in the state of Texas, and I saw one person from the state of Texas, and I want to do a shout out to her because I'm so glad we have Texas represented. And you were right, Dr. Nicole, we have East Coast, West Coast, Alaska time, Central time, and it's so great that we're getting the information out.
I got to shout out Jennifer. She's from Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania in the house.
Yay.
Well, while people are coming with some questions, Dr. Nicole, is there any parting words you want to leave with us? You gave us so much information. Anything you want to leave to participants?
I would just say I'm just, again, honored to be in this space with all of you and to have a participant say that they will be joining the educational field soon and that this was helpful. That lets me know that the work is not in vain, and definitely please leverage your powers because we do all have them and it's tough. It's tough out there right now and we're tired, we're exhausted. But if you can, I saw Dr. Brun say, muster up, just muster up the power. It does make a difference.
It absolutely does. And one thing about doing this work is that we may not see the fruit of our labor, but it's so important to, like I said earlier, planting those seeds, keep doing the work and believing that they will fall on fertile ground and will produce a good harvest in the end. So thank you again, Dr. Holland Sims, for being with us and kicking off this series.
Dr. Graffenreid, there were 2 questions in the Q&A that just popped in.
Okay, yes. Great. Paige is asking, Washington is notoriously behind on RTI implementation, and I find districts to be very slow while building staff are eager. At the building level, it feels like starting over every year. How can we spread the ideas for more fidelity from the building up? With love from a fellow school psych.
Oh, yay, Paige. Yeah, so interestingly enough, I have experience with this. In the school district that I was a school psych in, at that time, we had a special ed director who said, you know, we want our school psychs to be the internal coaches for some of the buildings. Not all buildings were selected to do a pilot around PBIS. And I can remember in that role, there was a lot of naysaying, like this will never work, this type of district, these type of buildings, this type of thing will never work with our kids. And what I found is that the proof was in the pudding. And if you could show them, meaning you could show a decrease in the data that was showing high discipline, et cetera, you could show a change in the school climate information, that tended to be something that got the district's attention. And in that attention, they wanted to see, what did you do that was so different? And how did you do it, in my case, at a middle school? And so when districts are a little slow to kind of uptake some of this, it's having those actual implementers be the speakers for how this work could actually be done. So that's one idea on how to make it clear that there's utility in the frameworks that we're putting in place.
Thank you. Next question. When you were talking about the time stone, you mentioned a resource for monitoring the progress of our equity work. I missed it. Was there a link or a screenshot for that? Thank you. And she says, this has been hugely helpful, and I'm excited to see the ways that this will help our equity team shift our school culture.
Awesome. Yes. So interestingly enough, I know Dr. Graffenried is going to highlight who's coming up in the series, but Dr. Fergus is the person who I was able to get those 4 steps from. The progress monitoring calendar that's embedded in the link, which I think everyone's going to get a copy of the PowerPoint. I'm pretty sure that's embedded there. Yeah. Okay. That's embedded there. And that comes from the Wisconsin RTI Center.
Great. Thank you. And then last, Larry says, no question, but loved it all. And we'll be stealing the green between the yellow and blue.
Thanks, Larry. Perfect.
That is so wonderful. Thank you guys for your questions. And anytime you get the opportunity to pick someone's brain, I always encourage you to ask a question, particularly when we have them their undivided attention. So thank you, Dr. Holland Sims. And yeah, you're right. We're going to again tell you guys who's coming up in our series. Yes. So in April, we will have folks who are actually doing the work in the district, which I love, because sometimes those of us who work at the universities, we are not always, I hate the term boots on the ground, but we're not. And so if you come in April, you'll get to hear from Tanara Blunt and Tiana Bial, who will talk about doing the work, ensuring equity and cultural responsiveness and urban implementation within the MTSS framework. So again, that's April 17th, same time, same place. And then my good friend, Dr. Eddie Fergus, will wrap up our series on May 22nd. He'll be talking about the climate of educator bias-based beliefs effect on MTSS implementation. So we're so excited that Nicole kicked us off in this series, and excited about those who will add to what she's already offered today. All right. And your feedback is important. We want to invite you to fill out the evaluation, where you can get certificates of attendance, and Washington in-service forms can be accessed after completing the evaluation. So if you are a school psych or someone who needs professional development credit, please fill that out for your benefit and for us to get the feedback. We really appreciate it. Want to let you know that SAMSO sponsors this work, but does not reflect any official position on this content. So that's what this disclaimer is about. And last but not least, these are all the ways that you can get in contact with us. You can get in contact with the UW Smart Center via our email, Twitter, our QR code, and again, the Northwest School Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. Also, you can reach us these different ways, and our QR code and our website. All right. Thank you so much.